You won't want to miss this. Before we jump in, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. The door slid open with a barely audible hiss. Kale Viren jolted upright in his small but secure quarters, his hand darting under the pillow to grip the smooth metal of his sidearm. No one had clearance to access his personal space, especially not in the middle of a delicate peace negotiation on the fractious world of Avaris. The dim glow of the emergency lights cast a faint shadow over the figure stepping inside. Kale's grip tightened, his mind already racing through potential scenarios. Sabotage? An assassination attempt? The figure moved quickly, with a mix of urgency and grace, before pausing just inside the door. She wore the ceremonial attire of an Avaran dignitary, but her silken garments were torn and streaked with dust, her golden skin faintly bruised. Her wide, amber eyes locked onto his. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I need your help." Kale's expression didn't soften. He'd spent weeks navigating the razor-thin line between diplomacy and disaster on this volatile planet. Every move, every word, was calculated to prevent the fragile ceasefire between Avaris' warring factions from collapsing. And now, this stranger. No, not a stranger. He recognized her. She had been a silent presence at the negotiation table, standing behind one of the key envoys. A diplomat herself? No, too young for that. Perhaps a noblewoman. Kale's voice was low, cautious. "Who are you, and why are you in my room?" Her gaze flicked toward the still-ajar door before returning to him. "They're coming for me. I had nowhere else to go." He studied her for a moment, his instincts warring with the alarms blaring in his head. "Who's coming?" "The guards," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "And the man they've decided I will marry." Kale blinked, caught off guard. "You're running from an arranged marriage." Her face hardened, her amber eyes flashing with defiance. "I'm running from imprisonment. He doesn't want a wife. He wants a pawn. And I'd rather die than let them use me." The sharp trill of an alarm rang out, cutting through the compound's silence. Kale cursed under his breath. The search was already underway, and it wouldn't take long for the guards to arrive. He had seconds to decide. He could turn her in, protect his diplomatic mission, and stay out of a conflict that wasn't his. Or he could take a risk, a massive, career-ending risk, and help her. Kale made his choice. "Hide. Now." He gestured toward the small alcove at the far end of the room. She hesitated for the briefest moment, then slipped into the shadows. Kale straightened, tugging on his jacket and forcing his expression into one of irritation as the door slid open once more. 3 guards stepped inside, their faces grim and weapons prominently displayed. The leader, a hulking man with a deep scar running down the side of his face, glanced around the room before fixing his gaze on Kale. "Ambassador Viren," the guard said flatly. "We are conducting a search." Kale leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "In my quarters? You're aware that these rooms are protected under the diplomatic accords?" "Yes." The guard didn't flinch. "A woman has gone missing. She may have entered this sector." Kale sighed dramatically, letting exasperation seep into his tone. "And you think she's hiding in my room? At this hour? I've been asleep, trying to prepare for another grueling day of negotiations, and now you're interrupting me with baseless accusations." The guard's expression didn't change. "We have orders to search every chamber. Stand aside." Kale's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "With all due respect," he said, tapping the insignia embroidered on his jacket, a golden crest representing the Galactic Mediation Corps. "You don't have the authority to search this room without a warrant. Surely you don't want to cause an interplanetary incident over this." For a long, tense moment, the guard said nothing, his sharp eyes scanning the room from where he stood. Kale remained in the doorway, deliberately blocking the man's line of sight. Finally, the guard exhaled sharply. "If you see anything unusual," he said, his tone laced with warning, "report it immediately." "Of course," Kale said, his voice cool. The guards turned and left, their heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. Kale waited a full 30 seconds before shutting the door and locking it. The woman emerged from her hiding spot, her expression unreadable. "You're a skilled liar," she said softly. Kale shook his head. "Comes with the job." He gestured for her to sit. "Start talking. Who are you, and why are they after you?" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "My name is Talira Draven. My father is Elder Draven, head of the Sovereign Council." Kale swore under his breath. The Sovereign Council ruled Avaris, which meant Talira wasn't just a noblewoman. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful figures on the planet. "Do you have any idea what kind of chaos you've just dragged me into?" he demanded, pacing the small room. "If they find you here, if they even suspect I'm helping you, this entire mission is dead in the water." "I didn't ask for your help," she snapped. "No," Kale shot back. "You demanded it by barging into my quarters. Now we're both stuck in this mess." Talira's expression softened slightly. "I had no choice. My father has promised me to Warlord Karesh. She faltered, her voice dropping. "He's a tyrant. He'll use me to cement his power and crush the Council's opposition. If that happens, there will be no peace, only war." Kale studied her, his frustration warring with a grudging sense of admiration. Despite her situation, she hadn't broken down or pleaded for pity. She was determined, even defiant. "All right," he said finally. "Here's the deal. If you want me to help you, you follow my lead. No arguments, no surprises. Understood?" Talira hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Kale moved to his desk, pulling out a small bundle of folded clothing, a spare diplomatic uniform. He tossed it to her. "Put this on. It'll help you blend in." She arched an eyebrow. "Do you always carry disguises?" He gave her a wry smile. "Welcome to diplomacy. We plan for everything." As she changed, Kale turned away, focusing on their next move. His mind raced through the security layout of the compound, mapping the fastest route to the transport bay. When Talira stepped forward, now dressed in the sleek, dark uniform of a Galactic Mediation Corps assistant, Kale gave her an appraising look. The clothes were slightly loose on her, but they concealed her distinct features well enough. "It'll do," he said. "Let's move." The corridor outside was quiet as they stepped into the shadows. Kale led the way, his heart pounding as he scanned for patrols. They had a long night ahead, and every step carried the weight of potential disaster. Kale and Talira moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridors of the Avaran compound. The diplomatic quarters, though secure, were not impenetrable. Kale had memorized the facility's layout as part of his preparation, but this was the first time he'd needed to put that knowledge to use under such dire circumstances. Talira followed closely, her steps light but deliberate. She seemed calm, but Kale noticed how her hands flexed occasionally, her fingers curling and uncurling as if to release nervous energy. Despite her earlier bravado, the gravity of their situation wasn't lost on her. "We'll need to get past the central security checkpoint," Kale whispered, glancing over his shoulder at her. "If we're lucky, the guards won't ask too many questions." "And if we're not?" Talira asked, her voice low but steady. "Then we improvise." They rounded a corner, the hum of machinery and distant voices growing louder. The compound's central checkpoint was up ahead, a bottleneck of security measures designed to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive areas. Kale's mind raced, planning their approach. The two guards stationed at the checkpoint straightened as they approached. Kale adjusted his posture, adopting the air of an impatient bureaucrat. He gestured curtly toward Talira, who had pulled her hood low over her face. "Ambassador Viren," one of the guards greeted, his tone stiff but respectful. Kale waved a hand dismissively. "I've been called to an emergency session with the Mediation Council. Apparently, Warlord Karesh is demanding more concessions again." He sighed, feigning exasperation. "If this goes on much longer, I'll need a separate delegation just to handle his complaints." The guard chuckled faintly, but his eyes shifted to Talira. "And your assistant?" Kale gave the man a withering look. "New. You don't expect me to go through this circus without someone keeping track of the endless minutiae, do you? The guard hesitated, his gaze lingering on Talira for a moment longer than Kale liked. She didn't flinch, holding herself in a way that perfectly mimicked the deferential posture of an assistant. Of course, Ambassador, the guard said, stepping aside. You're clear to proceed. Kale nodded curtly and walked through the scanner, Talira following close behind. His heart was pounding, but he didn't let it show. The scanner emitted a faint blue pulse as they passed through, and for a moment, Kale thought they were in the clear. Then the alarm beeped. Wait, the guard called out, his voice sharp. Kale turned slowly, forcing a sigh of annoyance. Now what? The scanner picked up something, the guard said, gesturing for Talira to step forward. Kale rolled his eyes. It's her identification chip. The mediation core issued it, and your system probably doesn't recognize it. We've had this problem before with off-world tech. The guard frowned, clearly unconvinced. Kale motioned impatiently toward Talira. Show them your ID manually, he said, his tone clipped. Talira reached into her jacket and pulled out the forged identification Kale had given her earlier. She handed it to the guard without a word, her movements calm and precise. The guard examined it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the holographic seal. Kale tapped his foot impatiently. Unless you'd like me to be late for the council and explain that your checkpoint is slowing down diplomatic progress, I suggest you move this along. The guard finally nodded, handing the ID back. You're clear. Apologies for the delay. Kale gave a curt nod and strode forward, Talira matching his pace. They didn't speak until they were well out of earshot, moving through a quieter section of the compound. That was close, Talira said, her voice low. Too close, Kale muttered. We can't afford another holdup like that. The more attention we attract, the worse this gets. They moved deeper into the compound, sticking to maintenance corridors and less monitored routes. The air grew cooler, and the hum of machinery became more pronounced as they approached the transport bay. Why did you lie for me? Talira asked suddenly, her voice breaking the tense silence. Kale glanced at her, surprised by the question. What do you mean? You could have handed me over back there, she said. It would have been easier. Safer. Kale hesitated, his gaze fixed ahead. I told you. You came to my room. That made it my problem. That's not an answer. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I'm a mediator. My job is to find solutions that don't involve throwing people to the wolves. If I'd turned you in, I'd have been complicit in whatever Karesh has planned for you. I couldn't live with that. Talira studied him for a moment, her amber eyes narrowing slightly. You're more idealistic than I expected. Kale smirked faintly. Don't mistake pragmatism for idealism. I'm just trying to survive this mess without starting a planetary war. As they approached the transport bay, Kale motioned for Talira to stay close. The bay was a sprawling expanse of polished metal and glowing control panels, with rows of sleek ships lined up for inspection. A handful of engineers moved between the vessels, their attention focused on their work. We need something fast and unregistered, Kale said, scanning the ships. Talira's gaze swept the bay before landing on a compact black vessel near the far wall. Its angular design and lack of insignia made it the perfect choice. That one, she said, nodding toward the ship. Kale followed her line of sight and nodded. Good choice. They moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows as they crossed the bay. Kale's pulse quickened with every step, the weight of the risk pressing down on him. He didn't dare look back to see if anyone had noticed them. When they reached the ship, Kale pressed a hand to the access panel. The hatch hissed open, and they slipped inside, sealing the door behind them. Get us in the air, Kale said, moving toward the co-pilot's seat. Talira slid into the pilot's chair, her fingers flying over the controls with practiced ease. The ship hummed to life, its engines thrumming softly beneath them. As the vessel rose from the ground, a voice crackled over the comms. Unauthorized launch detected. Identify yourself or prepare to be intercepted. Kale swore under his breath. How fast can you get us out of here? Talara didn't answer. Instead, she pushed the engines to full throttle, the ship surging forward as alarms blared throughout the bay. A moment later, the bay doors began to close, their massive metal panels sliding together with ominous speed. "They're trying to trap us," Kale said, his voice tight. Talara's jaw clenched. "Not if I can help it." The gap in the doors grew smaller with each passing second. Kale gripped the armrests of his seat, his breath caught in his throat. The ship shot through the narrow opening just before the doors slammed shut, hurtling into the open sky. For a brief moment, Kale felt the weightlessness of freedom. Then the comms crackled again. "This is Warlord Karesh. Stand down or face destruction." Kale turned to Talara, his eyes wide. "You're going to tell me who this guy is, right?" Her expression darkened. "He's the man they want me to marry." Kale let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Of course he is." As enemy ships appeared on the radar, Kale realized their fight was far from over. The black vessel darted through the Avaran sky, its sleek form gliding between the turbulent clouds. Kale Viren gripped the co-pilot's chair tightly, his eyes fixed on the holographic displays flickering on the control panel. For enemy ships were in pursuit, their triangular profiles glowing crimson on the radar. They were fast, and the distance between them was closing rapidly. "How long until we can jump to light speed?" Kale asked, his voice strained. Talara Draven's hands flew over the controls, her focus unshaken. "The hyperdrive needs another 5 minutes to charge." Kale glanced at the monitor. The enemy ships were less than 2 kilometers behind them. "We don't have 5 minutes." A warning light began flashing on the console. The calm yet foreboding voice of the ship's onboard AI filled the cockpit. "Missile lock detected." Kale's heart dropped. "You've got to be kidding me." Talara barely hesitated, yanking the throttle hard to the right. The ship lurched, the sudden change in trajectory throwing Kale against his restraints. A bright streak of plasma shot past their viewport, narrowly missing them before detonating in a flash of fire and light. "Can you do something about those missiles?" Kale shouted, fumbling with the ship's weapons interface. Talara smirked grimly. "Relax, diplomat. I've got this." She flipped a switch, and a series of automated countermeasures deployed from the ship's hull. Small drones shot out in every direction, emitting electromagnetic pulses that scrambled the enemy's targeting systems. The pursuing ships faltered momentarily, their formation breaking apart. Kale exhaled in relief, but it was short-lived. The enemy vessels quickly regrouped, their glowing red weapon systems locking onto them once more. "Any other tricks up your sleeve?" Kale asked, bracing himself as the ship rocked from another near miss. Talara's jaw tightened. "Just one. Hold on." She veered the ship downward, plunging them into a dense layer of storm clouds. Lightning crackled around them, illuminating the cockpit in harsh bursts of light. The turbulence was brutal, tossing the ship like a leaf in a hurricane. Kale gritted his teeth, gripping the armrests as the vessel bucked wildly. "This is your plan? Fly us into a death storm." "They can't track us in here," Talara said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "And if they try to follow, the storm will do the hard work for us." Another lightning bolt streaked past, close enough to make the entire cockpit shudder. Kale wasn't sure if he found her confidence reassuring or infuriating. The enemy ships hesitated at the edge of the storm, their pilots clearly reluctant to risk flying into the chaotic environment. For a moment, it seemed like they had lost their pursuers. Then the comms crackled again. "This is Warlord Karesh. Talara Draven, you cannot escape me. Surrender now, or I will drag you back in chains." Talara's face hardened, her amber eyes blazing with fury. "Karesh," she muttered, venom dripping from the word. Kale studied her, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands gripped the controls. "I'm guessing this isn't the first time he's threatened you." Talara didn't look at him. "Karesh doesn't make threats. He makes promises." Kale leaned forward, his tone firm but calm. "Then maybe it's time you tell me exactly what we're up against." Talara hesitated, her fingers hesitating over the controls. Karesh is more than just a warlord. He controls half the planet's military forces, and his influence within the Sovereign Council is growing every day. If he consolidates power, he'll crush anyone who opposes him, including my father. And marrying you gives him that power, Kale said, understanding dawning. She nodded. I'm just a tool to him, a means to an end. If he succeeds, Avaris will fall into tyranny, and the fragile peace you've been negotiating will shatter. Kale sat back, absorbing her words. The stakes were higher than he'd realized. This wasn't just about one woman's freedom. It was about the future of an entire planet. Before he could respond, the Eye's voice interrupted them. Enemy vessels entering storm field. Distance, 1.2 kilometers. Kale swore under his breath. They're following us in. Talara's expression darkened. Fools. The storm will tear them apart. Kale wasn't so sure. Warlord Karesh wasn't the kind of man to underestimate his opponents. If he was willing to send his ships into the storm, he must have had a plan. Another warning flashed on the console. This time, it wasn't a missile lock. Boarding craft detected, the AI announced. Kale's eyes widened. Boarding craft? You mean they're trying to? The ship shuddered violently as a small, spike-shaped vessel latched onto their hull. The sound of metal screeching against metal echoed through the cabin. They are breaching the ship, Talara said, her voice cold with determination. Kale unbuckled his harness, grabbing a plasma pistol from the weapons locker. Any chance we can shake them off? Talara shook her head. Not in this storm. We'll have to deal with them ourselves. Kale followed her toward the rear of the ship, his heart pounding. He wasn't a soldier. His training in self-defense was rudimentary at best, but he wasn't about to let Talara face this alone. The breech hatch hissed open, and Kale raised his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. A group of armored soldiers poured into the ship, their helmets glowing with red visors. Stay behind me, Talara ordered, leveling her own weapon. Kale ignored her, taking aim at the nearest soldier and firing. The plasma bolt struck the man in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. Talara moved with lethal precision, her shots finding their targets with unerring accuracy. The confined space of the ship worked to their advantage, forcing the enemy soldiers to advance single file through the narrow corridor. But the soldiers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Kale and Talara were forced to retreat, falling back toward the cockpit. We can't hold them off forever, Kale said, his voice strained. We don't have to, Talara replied, her eyes flicking toward the hyperdrive console. The jump is ready. Kale's eyes widened. You want to jump while they're still on board? Talara smirked grimly. Better than letting them drag us back to Karesh. Kale nodded, trusting her judgment. Do it. Talara slammed her hand onto the control panel, and the ship lurched violently as the hyperdrive engaged. The stars outside the viewport stretched into streaks of light, and the pursuing vessels vanished in an instant. The sudden acceleration threw the remaining soldiers off balance, giving Kale and Talara the opening they needed to finish them off. Plasma bolts filled the air, and within moments, the ship was silent once more. Kale slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. Remind me never to doubt you again. Talara holstered her weapon, her expression unreadable. We're not safe yet. Kale frowned. What do you mean? We lost them, didn't we? Talara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the control panel. Karesh doesn't give up easily. He'll follow us to the ends of the galaxy if he has to. Kale sighed, running a hand through his hair. Then we'd better make sure he can't find us. Talara nodded, her resolve hardening. Agreed. But that means we'll need to go somewhere even Karesh wouldn't dare to follow. Kale raised an eyebrow. And where would that be? Talara's lips curved into a faint smile. I have an idea. The black ship hurtled through the vastness of space, its hyperdrive finally disengaging as it emerged near the edge of a desolate star system. The surrounding void was dotted with faintly glowing gas clouds and the distant light of a dying red sun. The ship's hum settled into a quieter rhythm, and the cockpit's displays flickered as systems recalibrated after the jump. Kale slumped in the co-pilot's seat, running a hand over his face. Every muscle in his body ached, and his mind was still racing from the chaotic fight with Karesh's soldiers. "Please tell me this system isn't on any of Karesh's charts," he said, glancing at Talira. She leaned back in the pilot's chair, her fingers hovering over the controls. "It's not. This sector is unclaimed and barely explored. Even the most desperate smugglers avoid it." Kale raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Talira tilted her head toward the viewport, gesturing at the swirling nebula outside. "The Persean Rift. It's unstable, unpredictable. Ships that venture too close don't come back. If Karesh follows us here, he'll be taking a risk even he might find unacceptable." Kale's gaze lingered on the rift, its ghostly hues casting faint shadows over the cockpit. "And us? How close are we planning to get?" "Close enough to hide," Talira said simply. Kale leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "I'll take hiding over fighting a warlord's fleet any day." Talira nodded, but her expression remained tense. Kale could see the weight of their ordeal settling over her, the resolve she'd shown during the chase now giving way to exhaustion. She was silent as she adjusted their course, the ship angling toward the outer edge of the rift. For the first time since meeting her, Kale saw not the defiant daughter of a powerful council elder, but a young woman fighting to stay ahead of forces far beyond her control. The ship settled into orbit around a small, barren moon on the edge of the rift. Its surface was jagged and lifeless, providing natural cover from any potential scans. Kale and Talira sat in the cramped common area of the ship, their weapons and equipment spread out on the table between them. Kale picked up a plasma pistol, checking its charge. "What's the plan now?" he asked. "We can't stay here forever." Talira hesitated, her amber eyes flicking to the viewport. "I need to send a message to my father." Kale froze. "You're joking, right? Karesh probably has your family's communications under constant surveillance." "That's exactly why I need to do it carefully," she said. "My father isn't a fool. He'll know how to respond without giving anything away." Kale frowned. "And what do you think he'll do? Storm Karesh's stronghold with the Council's troops?" "No," Talira said quietly. "But if I can convince him to withdraw his support from the marriage pact, Karesh loses his claim to power." Kale leaned back, rubbing his temples. "That's a big if, Talira. And even if it works, Karesh won't just let you go." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But it's the only way to stop him. This isn't just about me anymore, Kale. If Karesh consolidates power, Avaris will fall into chaos. Millions of lives are at stake." Kale sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And here I thought mediating trade disputes would be the hardest part of this mission." Talira offered him a faint smile. "You could have walked away, you know." "Yeah, well, I've never been great at taking the easy path," he said, shaking his head. "Let's get to work." Over the next several hours, Kale and Talira worked together to craft a secure message. Using the ship's encrypted systems and rerouting through the unstable energy fields of the Persean Rift, they managed to transmit the message in bursts that would be nearly impossible to trace. As they waited for a response, they turned their attention to the ship itself. The battle with Karesh's soldiers had left several systems damaged, and repairs were crucial if they were to survive another encounter. "You're good at this," Kale said, watching as Talira recalibrated the ship's navigation array with practiced efficiency. "I had good teachers," she replied, not looking up. "My father insisted I learn engineering, military tactics, and diplomacy. He said a leader should understand the tools of war as well as the tools of peace." Kale smirked. "Sounds like a lot of pressure for a kid." "It was," she admitted. "But it prepared me for this. For fighting back." Kale studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You're a lot tougher than I gave you credit for, Talira." She finally looked at him, a hint of warmth breaking through her guarded demeanor. "And you're a lot braver than you pretend to be, Kale." Before he could respond, the ship's comms chirped, signaling an incoming transmission. Talara rushed to the console, her fingers flying over the controls. The holographic display lit up, showing a heavily encrypted message. As she decrypted it, Kale leaned over her shoulder, his heart pounding. The message was brief, but its meaning was clear: support withdrawn. Karesh will fall. Talara exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging with relief. He did it. My father pulled the council's support. Kale frowned. Won't that just make Karesh more desperate? He'll come after you with everything he has. I know, Talara said, her expression grim. But now he's fighting alone. Without the council's backing, his resources are limited. It's only a matter of time before his rivals take advantage. Kale nodded slowly. So what's our next move? Talara hesitated, then turned to face him. I need to go back. Kale blinked. Back? Are you insane? Karesh will kill you the moment he gets the chance. Not if I confront him publicly, she said. With the council watching, he won't dare harm me. He'll be forced to retreat, or risk losing what little support he has left. Kale stared at her, his mind racing. The plan was bold, reckless, and dangerous. But he could see the determination in her eyes, the unshakable resolve of someone willing to risk everything for her people. All right, he said finally. But I'm coming with you. Talara smiled faintly. I wouldn't have it any other way. The journey back to Avaris was tense, every moment fraught with the possibility of ambush. But Karesh's forces, now fractured and disorganized, posed little threat. When Talara and Kale arrived at the Sovereign Council chambers, they were met with shocked murmurs and wary glances. Karesh was there, his imposing figure radiating fury as he rose from his seat. Talara Draven, he growled. You dare show your face here? Talara stepped forward, her voice ringing out with authority. I am no longer your pawn, Karesh. Your bid for power has failed. The council sees you for what you are, a tyrant. The chamber erupted into chaos as council members argued and shouted over one another. Karesh's face twisted with rage, but he remained silent, knowing that any overt aggression would only confirm Talara's accusations. Kale stood at Talara's side, his hand resting on his weapon as he watched the warlord carefully. By the end of the day, the council voted to strip Karesh of his command and exile him from Avaris. As Karesh was escorted from the chambers, Talara turned to Kale. It's over, she said, her voice heavy with relief. Kale smiled. You did it, Talara. You saved your people. She looked at him, her amber eyes softening. I couldn't have done it without you. As they left the chambers together, Kale felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. Talara's fight had become his own, and though their paths would diverge, he knew he would never forget her, or the unlikely alliance that had changed both their lives.